Welcome to Part 2 of Murder and Marriage. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 4. Raffles. As David Curtis stepped into John Norby's bedroom, Dr. Leonard de la Cruz quickly moved forward, his eyes widening in surprise. "Dave, is it really you?" he exclaimed. "Penfield mentioned a Dr. Curtis was here, but I didn't realize it was you." He examined his old friend closely, and his initial excitement shifted to a look of compassion. His grip tightened around Curtis's hand. "I'm Leonard de la Cruz," Curtis replied, a hint of relief washing over his tired features. "I recognized your voice right away." "Still with those keen ears," de la Cruz said, pulling out a chair and assisting his blind companion into it. "I remember your memory tests. They were something else." "Freakish might be a better word," Curtis interrupted, letting out a short sigh that de la Cruz caught. "My early training is serving me well, for which," he added with a whimsical smile, "thankfully." A movement to his right caught his attention, causing him to pause as Coroner Penfield entered the room. "Do you two know each other?" he asked, noticing de la Cruz's hand resting on Curtis's shoulder. "Oh, absolutely," de la Cruz replied with a broad smile. "We were buddies at McGill Institute in Canada and graduated together. I came here while Dr. Curtis went to Boston, where I stayed until heading overseas with the Canadian forces at the start of the World War," Curtis continued. "I served with them until we entered the war, and then joined an American medical unit. I was blinded in the Argonne." He paused, then inquired, "Am I speaking with Coroner Penfield?" "My apologies. I thought you two were already acquainted," de la Cruz interjected as Penfield shook Curtis' outstretched hand. "I know Dr. Curtis by reputation," Penfield replied. "It's a pleasure to meet you, even under such grim circumstances," and he shook Curtis' hand firmly before letting go. "It is grim indeed," de la Cruz responded solemnly. "A truly shocking situation." His sentiment was echoed by Sam Jackson, who entered the room just then, followed closely by Inspector Cowser. "Norby's suicide has completely shocked me," he said, as the men gathered around Curtis, who was the only one seated in that corner of the room. "It's unfathomable, astonishing. A man in such good health." "Wait a moment," Coroner Penfield raised his hand. "Let me handle the questioning, Jackson." He turned to de la Cruz. "You were Mr. Norby's family doctor, isn't that right?" "Yes, for the past 5 years." "Was he in good health?" "He had made a wonderful recovery from a nervous breakdown," de la Cruz explained. "Yes, I would say he was enjoying normal health until last night." "Why until last night?" Jackson asked, his voice edged with curiosity, causing Penfield to scowl at the interruption. "Last night, he died," de la Cruz replied flatly, ready to elaborate, but was again interrupted by Penfield. "Can you tell us the exact time you found Norby, Dr. Curtis?" he inquired, turning his attention to the surgeon. 2:15 this morning," Curtis answered. "Norby was already dead when I stumbled over his body." He paused. "However, I should note that he died only shortly before I arrived." "How can you be certain of that?" Jackson pressed, and de la Cruz raised his eyebrows at the lawyer's abruptness, his tone anything but courteous. "By the warmth of his body and its limp state," Curtis replied quietly, his unseeing eyes fixed in Jackson's direction. "Also, I heard Norby as he came down the corridor just before I reached the staircase." "Did he walk quickly?" Jackson asked before Inspector Cowser could respond. Curtis shook his head. "He seemed to drag one foot after the other, and then I heard a soft thud." "Probably staggered down the hall and fell," Cowser interjected. "But where was he going?" Jackson persisted, undeterred by Coroner Penfield's growing annoyance with his relentless questions. "We have yet to find an answer to that," Cowser replied. "He was probably trying to summon help," de la Cruz suggested. But the house telephone is right here, Jackson countered. If he'd regretted his actions and wanted immediate assistance, he wouldn't have needed to leave his room and crawl down the hall to find it. He glared at the others. Why didn't John call out? That would have been the quickest way to wake us up. A man with a gash that deep in his throat wouldn't have had enough breath to shout, de la Cruz pointed out. He couldn't have survived more than 10 minutes after. Inflicting it, Jackson added. It's even more remarkable that he left his room and attempted to navigate this winding corridor. Coroner Penfield and Inspector Cowser exchanged looks. Mr. Jackson, Cowser asked, when did you last see Norby? On my way to bed, the lawyer replied. I checked in for a moment. It was just after I left you in the library, he said, turning to Curtis. Around 11:20, I think. And where was Norby? Cowser asked patiently. Here in his room, reading in bed, as was his habit. Jackson twisted the ends of his waxed mustache until they pointed skyward. Did he seem to be in his usual health, or did he show any, morbid tendencies? Cowser stumbled slightly over his words, but Jackson's response came quickly. He seemed like himself, except he was unusually excited about he glanced sideways at Curtis. Arrangements for his niece Brandi's marriage to Dr. Curtis. Curtis lifted his head. Oh, so you told him the outcome of our conversation, he asked. Yes. Did he seem satisfied? Yes. Jackson paused before continuing. John insisted that I draft the prenuptial agreements so he could sign them before I left. Oh, so he signed some legal papers, did he? Cowser scrutinized the lawyer, then turned his gaze to Curtis. The latter's expression left him puzzled, and he pressed on without breaking eye contact with the blind doctor. Can I see the papers? Jackson shook his head. I don't have them, he replied. I left the documents on the bed next to John Norby. In unison, the coroner, Inspector Cowser, and Leonard de la Cruz turned to look at the intricately carved four-poster mahogany bed that dominated one side of the spacious room. The bed clearly showed signs of having been slept in, the pillows were disheveled, and the covers were thrown back in a haphazard manner. A dressing gown lay crumpled on the floor, not far from the bed. While there were no papers scattered across the sheets, a troubling red stain had spread in a jagged line from the undersheet to the carpet. Curtis broke the long silence. I take it the documents aren't on the bed now, based on your quietness, he remarked. Besides you, Jackson, who knew that Norby had prepared this, what did you call it? Prenuptial agreement, Jackson interjected. The witnesses knew. And who were the witnesses? Cowser asked, with his notebook ready. Miss Stephanie Hull and Franklin McDermott. Jackson glanced around the bedroom, his gaze drifting toward a mahogany secretary positioned by one of the windows. Perhaps they're in Norby's desk. Hold on, Mr. Jackson, Coroner Penfield said, raising a hand to stop him. Nothing in this room is to be disturbed. Inspector Cowser and I will conduct a complete search later. In the meantime, do you have any notes, any record of the agreement that Norby signed last night that you could share with us? Jackson nodded. I made a rough copy, and if I recall correctly, I stuffed it into the pocket of my dinner jacket. I'll fetch it, he replied, heading toward the door, but he was halted by a question from Coroner Penfield. After the agreement was signed, were you the first to leave Mr. Norby, or did the witnesses go before you? He asked. Jackson took a moment to think. Franklin McDermott left right away, he said. Miss Hull and I were about to leave at the same time, but Norby called her back. I understand, Penfield said thoughtfully before looking back up. All right, Mr. Jackson, if you could get that document for me, I would appreciate it. As Jackson stepped through the doorway, Penfield turned to Cowser. Inspector, can you find Miss Hull and Mr. McDermott? McDermott, tell them I'd like to see them in the next half hour, de la Cruz instructed. Do you want to see them together? Cowser asked, pausing just shy of the door. No, individually, de la Cruz replied, and Cowser quickly departed as Teoscar, the Filipino servant, was about to enter. Teoscar stepped aside to let him pass. "Excuse me, sir," Teoscar said as he reappeared, bowing deeply to de la Cruz. "Dr. Penn is needed on the telephone." De la Cruz, familiar with Teoscar's tendency to shorten names, smiled. "He wants you, Penfield," he explained. As the coroner exited the bedroom with Teoscar in tow, de la Cruz closed the hall door and turned to Curtis. "Time seems to fade away, Dave," he said, pulling up a chair. "It feels like just yesterday we were together in Montreal. But we've wandered many a weary foot since old Lang Syne," Curtis quoted, his voice imbued with a wistful resonance that touched de la Cruz. "I've been thrilled to hear about your success and your wonderful marriage, Leonard." "My wife is, well," de la Cruz chuckled, a hint of shyness in his demeanor. "You must meet her to truly understand how much she means to me." "Why didn't you tell me? You were in Washington, Dave." "I meant to do so today anyway, even if this tragedy hadn't occurred," Curtis explained. "John Norby promised to bring me over to see you this morning." De la Cruz scrutinized him. "I had no idea you were such close friends with John Norby." "I'm not," Curtis interjected quickly. "I only met him 10 days ago at Walter Reed." "What?" Curtis nodded. "That's right. I saw Norby again on Monday, and he kindly insisted that I come over last Friday evening to spend the week with him." De la Cruz glanced at his watch before facing Curtis again. "Is it really true," he asked hesitantly, "that you're going to marry Brandi Norby?" Curtis nodded once more. "It sounds as wild as something out of an Arabian Nights tale," he said somberly. "Norby appealed to the daredevil spirit that still lingers in me with such an extraordinary offer." "What exactly was the offer?" de la Cruz asked. "Norby wanted me to marry his niece, Brandi, and said that after the ceremony I wouldn't have to see her again, except for a few months each year at 10 Acres, Curtis replied. "He agreed to provide $25,000 a year for each of us." "That's quite a sum," de la Cruz remarked. "And a form of mental degradation," the words came out almost as a whisper. "Norby tempted me more than he realized, to be burdened with blindness and poverty, and then being offered a way out, some means of support for what's left of my life, yet at the same time facing the humiliation of such a rescue. God!" He covered his face with his hand. De la Cruz leaned over and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "I get it," he said softly. "You agreed to Norby's proposal." "Only after the girl's mother told me Norby would disinherit his niece, leaving her without a penny," Curtis replied. "That's why I went along with the ceremony." "One for Brandi and 2 for herself," de la Cruz muttered under his breath, too quietly for Curtis to hear, then raised his voice. "Believe me, Dave, Mrs. Marshall Norby is a devil in a dress." Curtis let out a humorless laugh. "It sure seems that way," he agreed. "Just think about it. What a crazy scheme. A bride I've never even seen. I can't help but wonder if she's as ugly as Hecate or if she's got the temper of Xanthippe." "Neither, I promise you," said de la Cruz warmly. "Brandi Norby couldn't do anything mean or dishonorable. Raised in a convent, she's sometimes painfully shy, but she's full of character." And de la Cruz concluded, "She's very beautiful." Curtis ran a nervous hand across his sightless eyes. "What you say just makes our marriage seem even more inappropriate. In fact, it feels like a joke. I'm a failure, human driftwood, while Brandi Norby stands at the very start of her life with the whole world ahead of her." De la Cruz stood up and looked down at his friend. "Your blindness won't be a burden," he said firmly. "I know what you're capable of, Dave, your kind heart and incredible courage." "I'm not afraid of what the future holds for you or Brandi," she said. Just as Curtis was about to respond, she continued, "But I'm curious. What made Norby want you and Brandi to get married?" Curtis stood up and leaned on his cane. "Heavens, I have no idea," he replied. "I can't imagine why he wanted this marriage to happen, or why he chose me, a blind man and a stranger, to be the groom." De la Cruz looked at him, astonished. "That's most peculiar," he exclaimed after a moment. "Doesn't anyone have a clue as to why?" Sam Jackson mentioned last night that Norby would explain everything after the wedding, Curtis explained. But now he's gone. Another mystery, De La Cruz sighed. Honestly, Dave, you've got two intriguing puzzles to solve. Curtis moved a little closer. You think the two are connected? He asked. Norby's sudden insistence on this marriage, and then his death. De La Cruz paused. It's too soon to tell in this investigation, he admitted, and it would be premature to make any guesses. His voice faded as he looked around the bedroom. Curtis's hand on his shoulder brought him back to focus. Describe the room for me, Leonard, he suggested. Everything just as it is now. I estimate the room is about 15 by 22 feet, De La Cruz began. There are 4 windows opening onto a balcony, 2 facing east and 2 north. 2 closet doors stood in the room, one slightly open, while another led to the bathroom. And the furniture? Curtis asked, as De La Cruz paused. There's a 4-poster bed, a bedside table with a reading lamp and a smoking set on it, a highboy, and a bureau with a set of toilet silver. Curtis listened intently, absorbing each detail. Norby's desk secretary is by the east window, and there's a table covered with books and magazines, plus another reading lamp near the bathroom door. What about the chairs? 3 in total. One is a large, tufted lounging chair near the north window. There's a chair by the desk, and De La Cruz leaned slightly to look around, one by the bed. It's overturned, Curtis noted. De La Cruz looked at him in surprise. It is, but I can only see the legs from where we stand. How could you tell it was there and lying on the floor? Just a hunch, I suppose, or maybe just luck, Curtis said with a wry smile. On which side of the bed is it? The side Norby got out of? No, it's on the far side. Curtis nodded thoughtfully as he stepped closer. Direction is the bed? He asked. In response, De La Cruz guided him to it. With a touch as delicate as a woman's, Curtis glided his hands over the pillows and the bolster, careful not to disturb them. His fingers then moved across the sheet, pausing for a moment over the edges of the bloodstain before following its trail down the side of the bed, and from the valance to the carpet. He knelt down, tracing the carpet with his fingers just as the hall door swung open and Coroner Penfield walked in. He stopped short at the sight of David Curtis crawling across the floor, his long, sensitive fingers gliding along the carpet, and shot a questioning glance at De La Cruz. Before anyone could speak, Curtis broke the silence. Norby must have either stumbled or crouched here, he said, a twisted smile crossing his face. Oh, I forgot. You can see this and figure it out for yourselves. But we can't, Penfield interjected quickly. Why do you think Norby stopped here? It's not even on the way to the door. Look at the amount of blood in this spot, Curtis replied, lifting his gaze. See for yourself. But we can't see the blood, De La Cruz argued. The carpet is red. Exactly. Curtis paused as Penfield knelt down, feeling the area indicated by the blind surgeon. You're right, he exclaimed. The carpet is soaked with blood. What was Norby doing in this corner of the room? There are no stains on the mahogany wainscoting, he noted, turning to the left and running his hands over the wall, nor on the wallpaper. It's very possible that Norby lost his sense of direction, Curtis suggested, standing up. He must have been terribly weak from blood loss. It's remarkable he made it as far as he did with a wound like that. Is the bed to my left? Yes, this way. Penfield, just as curious as De La Cruz, followed Curtis back to the 4-poster bed. Inspector Cowser followed my instructions, and nothing has been disturbed in this bedroom. Are you absolutely sure no one has entered since you arrived? Curtis asked. Absolutely. Cowser has a detective outside the door and another on the balcony outside those windows, he said, gesturing in their direction. Well, what the... The coroner's voice faltered as Curtis, now on the opposite side of the bed, skillfully avoided the overturned chair and pulled back the sheet, blanket, and counterpane to reveal a parrot. The bird, its vibrant feathers disheveled, lay still on its side, eyes closed. Good Lord! Ruffles, De La Cruz exclaimed. Is he dead? Curtis picked up the parrot and examined it. There's a heartbeat. It's weak, but the bird is alive. Suddenly, he lifted the bird and sniffed at its beak, then leaned down where the parrot had been lying. Why on earth didn't the parrot get out from under the blankets before it got smothered? Penfield exclaimed. I always thought parrots were almost like humans. Ruffles is, de la Cruz insisted. I could tell you countless stories of his cleverness. Norby was devoted to that bird. He never got tired of listening to him talk. He said Ruffles filled the roles of wife and watchdog. Watchdog, Curtis looked up. He held the parrot up. Leonard, take him over to the window. The fresh air might revive him. He's been chloroformed. Well, I'll be damned, a voice called from behind them. It was Inspector Cowser, who had returned a moment earlier. He joined de la Cruz at the window and helped carry the parrot's stand. De la Cruz set Ruffles on the floor beneath the perch, refilled the water cup, sprinkled some of its contents on the bird, and pulled back the curtains so the air could blow gently on him. Curtis wiped his fingers on his handkerchief and turned to Coroner Penfield. Where did you move Norby's body? He asked. To the empty bedroom next door, Penfield replied. We'll perform an autopsy there within the hour. De la Cruz will assist me. Would you like to join us, Dr. Curtis? Yes, please. Curtis moved to the window. How's the parrot, Leonard? Coming around, Cowser replied on behalf of de la Cruz, who had stepped into the bathroom. Here you go, Ruffles, have some water. He held up the cup to the bird. Dr. Penfield, have you scheduled the inquest? Yes, it's set for this afternoon, the coroner replied. Will that work for you, Cowser? Absolutely. Cowser placed the parrot on its perch and gently rested a hand on its back as its beady black eyes stared at him unblinkingly. Will the inquest be here or at the morgue? I haven't made a final decision. Penfield stroked his chin thoughtfully. But I am certain that Norby's death was not a suicide. It was murder. De la Cruz re-entered the bedroom and halted in shock, staring at the coroner in disbelief. Curtis tucked the handkerchief back into his pocket and switched the cane to his right hand. May I inquire how you reached that conclusion, Dr. Penfield? Penfield paused, glancing back to ensure the hall door was closed. He then lowered his voice to a confidential tone as the men gathered closer. For one thing, he began, there's no weapon present. If Norby had taken his own life, the weapon would be in this room or in the hall. This is clearly a case of murder. A harsh croak from the parrot broke the tension, and they turned to look at the bird. Ruffles swayed drunkenly before speaking with surprising clarity. Brandi, I've caught you, you devil. Chapter 5. The Inquest. The sound of doors opening and closing, along with the faint murmur of voices, drifted to David Curtis as he sat by the window in his bedroom, his head resting on his hand and his sightless eyes, gazing toward the hills leading to the national capital. He had been in this position for nearly an hour, trying to sort through his chaotic thoughts. Amidst the confusion, one thought stood out. John Norby had undoubtedly been murdered. Who could have committed such a heinous act? Would the inquest provide any answers? In a break from tradition, Coroner Penfield had chosen to hold the inquest at 10 acres instead of the usual District of Columbia morgue, and he had set the time for 3 o'clock that afternoon. It must be close to that hour now. Curtis touched his repeater. 3:15. The inquest must have begun. He reached for his cane, but then let it fall back down. Coroner Penfield had assured him he would be summoned when his presence was needed. He had enjoyed both breakfast and lunch in splendid solitude in the small morning room upstairs, attended by Tiaska, who had been instructed by Mrs. Norby to act as his valet. Earlier that day, he had requested to speak with Brandi, but he received a message from Mrs. Norby saying that the girl was utterly distraught over her uncle's shocking death and was not able to see anyone. The entire household was clearly in disarray, a testament to the turmoil that had disrupted their normally well-run lives. It had taken all of Mrs. Norby's fiery spirit to quell the rising panic and keep the servants focused on their tasks. The staff was a mix of various nationalities. Jules, the chef, and his sister Suzanne, who served as Mrs. Norby's maid, had come from France before the outbreak of the Great War. Gretchen, the chambermaid, was a recent addition, arriving from Holland just the previous fall. Tiaskar and his twin brother, Damison, had been in John Norby's service since he brought them from the Philippine Islands 8 years ago. Starnes took pride in his position, boasting about his seniority. He had started as an office boy and eventually joined Norby's household as a valet before rising to butler. Curtis gauged the unusual buzz of excitement among the staff by Tiaskar's chatter, although one topic rendered him utterly silent: string. "You told me last night, Tiaskar, hang string on my door so I can find my bedroom," he repeated. "But please, Mr. Doctor, do not tell me that," he insisted politely. "I always do what you say. I'm a good boy." Right, I understand," Curtis replied, a hint of impatience slipping into his calm voice. "But how did it happen that a string was tied to the knob of Mr. Norby's bedroom door, leading me to think it was my room?" "I don't know," Tiaskar snapped, his words sharp and quick, making an almost hissing sound. "Please, Mr. Doctor, I don't know." With that, Curtis had no choice but to accept the answer. Shifted uncomfortably in his chair, wishing he could speak with Brandi before the inquest. As it stood, he was tackling the whole situation without any guidance. A bitter smile crossed his lips, like a blind man blindfolded. Did Brandi still intend to go through with the marriage her uncle had arranged? Was he to think of himself as engaged to her? He had been given no insight into the situation, no clue whether he was expected to stay at 10 Acres as a guest or leave right after the inquest. Mrs. Norby had kept her distance, but Tiaskar had informed him that the other guests had left for town, though they would return in time for the inquest. Leonard de la Cruz had hurried away right after the autopsy, but not before extracting a promise from Curtis that he would come to visit for at least a week if he chose to leave 10 Acres. A quiet knock at the door snapped Curtis out of his wandering thoughts. "Excuse me, Doctor, they need you downstairs," Tiaskar announced, stepping forward to offer his arm to Curtis. The coroner's jury watched the blind surgeon with keen interest as Tiaskar escorted him to the chair set aside for witnesses. After discussing matters with Mrs. Norby and Sam Jackson, it was decided to hold the inquest in the library. Coroner Penfield wasted no time in summoning his jury, while the servants, under Mrs. Norby's guidance, arranged tables and chairs, transforming the inviting living room into a suitable space for the preliminary investigation. The general public was not allowed in, but Coroner Penfield ensured that a large table with chairs was reserved for the press, who had arrived promptly. Dr. Mayo, the deputy coroner, busy taking notes for the opening of the inquest, put down his fountain pen and picked up a Bible. He stepped forward and administered the oath to Curtis, to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. As Curtis took his seat again and Mayo returned to his table, Coroner Penfield moved closer. "Please state your full name, occupation, and place of residence, Doctor," he asked. "David Curtis, surgeon, from Boston," Curtis replied succinctly. "I graduated from McGill Institute in 1906. I am 38 years old and lost my sight during the Argonne Offensive while serving with American troops." "And when did you return to this country?" the coroner inquired. "About 8 months ago." Curtis hesitated for a moment before adding, "I was wounded quite badly and spent time in various hospitals in France, so I wasn't fit to come back until recently. I arrived at Walter Reed Hospital a month ago for treatment, hoping it would improve my overall health." "When did you meet John Norby?" "He visited me 10 days ago." "Had you ever met him before that?" "Never." "What was the reason for his visit?" "Mr. Norby mentioned that a mutual friend, Arthur Reed, had written to him, saying I was at the hospital and asked him to check in on me," Curtis explained. "Mr. Norby took me out in his car several times and then invited me to spend this week at 10 Acres. "I see." Penfield adjusted his eyeglasses, which had slipped down his nose. "Had you met anyone from this household before coming here on Friday?" "No, they were all new to me." "Dr. Curtis," Penfield looked at his notes, "were you the first person to discover John Norby?" I was. Please describe the circumstances. Curtis cleared his throat. As I was coming up the staircase, I heard footsteps approaching, followed by a soft thud. I couldn't place the sound, so I continued up the stairs and down the corridor. In the next moment, I tripped over Norby's body. He paused. I couldn't find any signs of life. And how did you know it was John Norby lying there? Penfield asked. Since losing my sight, my fingers have become my eyes, Curtis replied. Norby had bumped his head against a door yesterday and asked me to check for any injuries. When I felt the small abrasion, I ran my fingers over his head and face, where I noticed his Van Dyke beard and that the top of his right ear was missing. This helped me identify the deceased. Penfield regarded Curtis thoughtfully, before asking another question. What did you do next? He inquired. I found my way into a bedroom and called for Mr. Sam Jackson, another guest, was on the house phone when I told him about my discovery, Curtis replied. He came right away. As Curtis finished speaking, the jury foreman leaned forward, casting a cautious glance at Penfield, and asked, Was the hallway lit, Dr. Curtis? Curtis hesitated, though barely noticeable. I couldn't see, he answered plainly. The foreman flushed, realizing in his eagerness that he was speaking to a blind man. But as I felt my way along the hall to the bedroom, my hand brushed against an electric fixture. Since the bulb was warm, I deduced that the corridor was lit. Penfield took a moment to jot down some notes on his pad. Did you hear anyone moving around, Doctor? Was there any noise that interrupted you while you examined Mr. Norby? Curtis shook his head. No, I didn't hear anything at all, he replied. As far as I could tell, I was alone in the hall with the deceased. What position was the body in when you found it? Penfield asked. Norby had obviously fallen forward, as he was lying partly turned onto his right side, with his face pressed against the carpet, Curtis said. His head was nearly touching the banister on that side of the staircase. Coroner Penfield looked around the library and noticed an empty chair next to the large open fireplace. That will be all for now, Dr. Curtis, he said. Why don't you have a seat over here? It'll be easier if I need to ask you something else. He guided Curtis to the empty chair before returning to the head of the large table where the jurors were seated. He then called Starnes, the butler, to the stand. The butler's troubled state was evident in his slow speech and dull expression. It took the combined efforts of Penfield and the deputy coroner to swear him in and to extract his age, full name, and the length of his service with John Norby. He was a kind master, Starnes said. Not that he didn't have his outbursts and moments of anger like any gentleman with a large household, but for the most part he was quite calm. And did Mr. Norby have one of his outbursts recently? Penfield asked. Starnes tugged at his red side whiskers. Born to German parents, he had been raised in England and brought to the United States at the age of 15 by an American diplomat. After leaving that position, he found his way to the brokerage firm where Norby and his brother, Marshall Norby, were then affiliated. He remained there as an office boy and general helper until Norby took him on as a valet. Yes, sir, he finally admitted. He's been in a mood ever since about a week ago. And what triggered this mood? Penfield asked patiently. I don't know, sir. Starnes hesitated, then added. He was critical of the cooking, complained about how the car was performing, scolded the postman for being late, and fussed at Miss Stephanie and Miss Brandi for keeping him waiting. He really let us all have it this week, sir. And you claim he was a kind master, Penfield commented dryly. A kind and generous master, Starnes insisted stubbornly. He always had his hand in his pocket to help someone. Did you ever hear Mr. Norby express hatred towards anyone? The coroner asked. Noticing Starnes' blank look, he pressed further. Did he ever say he particularly hated anyone? Starnes fingered his side whiskers again. In his demeanor and appearance, he resembled the quintessential English servant. I can't say for sure, sir, he replied evasively. I need a straightforward answer. Penfield's voice became more serious, and Starnes glanced at him with half-lidded eyes. Yes, sir, of course. But after 20 years of service, come this Christmas, I'd rather not. He hesitated. Speak ill of the family, sir. But if you insist, Starnes began, noticing Penfield's impatient demeanor. I heard Mr. Norby raise his voice quite harshly to a woman last night while I was heading to bed. And who was this woman? Come now, Penfield urged as Starnes hesitated once more. Your delay is wasting the court's time. Please answer promptly. Very well, Starnes straightened his bulky frame. As I was walking down the corridor after securing the house for the night, I caught Mr. Norby speaking. His bedroom door was slightly ajar. He said, I intend to have my way in this matter, no matter the consequences. Save your dramatics. Beggars can't be choosers. Not a penny of my money will go to. That's all I managed to hear, Starnes concluded. And the woman, who was she? Penfield pressed. Surely you must have seen her through the open door. Starnes shook his head in confusion. Not a glimpse of her face, he admitted. But there was a bit of her dressing gown reflected in the bathroom mirror, and it looked like one that Miss Brandi wears. Penfield studied the butler intently for a moment. What time was this? He inquired. In the corner by the fireplace, Curtis tightened his grip on his cane, the lines on his face hardening. Was Brandi Norby going to be pulled into this investigation already? It was just before midnight, Starnes replied with more confidence. I had locked up the house, as was my regular routine. Do you typically close the house at midnight? Asked Penfield. Oh, no, sir. The timing varies depending on when Mr. Norby and his guests turn in, Starnes explained quickly. I stayed up last night until after Mr. McDermott left. So he left last night, Penfield confirmed. Yes, sir. He came down just as I was securing the front door and asked me if he could grab his car from the garage, so I accompanied him and woke Damason. Damason? Penfield questioned. Yes, sir. He's Tiascar's twin brother and Mr. Norby's chauffeur. He sleeps in the lodge down by the gate, Starnes added. It took a while to wake him, and that made me late closing the house. I understand, Penfield fussed with his papers. Just one more question, Starnes. Did you find the house locked this morning as you had left it last night before going to bed? It was, sir. Starnes stood up straight, waiting respectfully, and when Penfield waved him off, he exited the library. As he headed toward the pantry, he hurried past the drawing-room upon seeing Mrs. Norby sitting quietly by the window, engrossed in a book. Sam Jackson wasted no time keeping Penfield waiting. His quick and polite responses to every question asked, after he took the oath, earned him appreciative glances from the reporters, whose eyes repeatedly darted to the clock on the mantel during Starnes' testimony. You said you prepared some legal papers last night for Mr. Norby, which he signed in the presence of Miss Stephanie Hull and Mr. Franklin McDermott, Coroner Penfield reiterated. Where are those papers now? I have no idea, Jackson replied. The last time I saw them, they were on the bed next to Mr. Norby. This morning, with Dr. Leonard de la Cruz and Inspector Cowser's help, I searched Norby's desk and his room, but I couldn't find any sign of the documents. Interesting, Penfield chewed on his lower lip, a habit he had when uncertain. What were those documents, Mr. Jackson? Jackson pulled out 2 folded sheets of paper and laid them out. This is a rough draft, he explained. It's known as a prenuptial agreement, and in it, Mr. Norby secured for his niece, Brandi Norby, and her fiancé, Dr. David Curtis, an annual income of $50,000, divided equally for their lifetime, along with a cash sum of $10,000 each upon their marriage within the week. He also, the lawyer spoke slowly, wanted to add a codicil to his will, revoking a $1 million bequest to Brandi and giving it instead to his cousin's daughter, Miss Stephanie Hull. Did he provide a reason for changing the inheritance from his niece to her cousin? Penfield asked, after a brief pause. He stated that Brandi Norby was sufficiently taken care of by the terms of the prenuptial agreement. Jackson placed the documents in the coroner's hands. I should also mention that if the marriage between Brandi and Dr. Curtis does not happen, Brandi will be disinherited. Penfield glanced over the 2 papers, then set them down in front of him. "These are rough, unsigned drafts," he said, addressing the jury before looking back at the lawyer. "Does the original will still stand?" "Yes, until we can find the codicil and the prenuptial agreement," Jackson replied. "Then Miss Brandi Norby inherits $1 million according to her uncle's will," Penfield stated with added seriousness. "And her cousin, Miss Stephanie Hull, will not receive that amount." "Correct." Jackson pulled out a handkerchief. "Brandi Norby will inherit a substantial fortune regardless of whether the will remains valid or if the codicil and the prenuptial agreement take effect. But as things stand, she will inherit $1 million without needing to get married," Penfield noted dryly, glancing at Curtis. The latter had gradually pushed his chair back, positioning himself in a way that shielded him from the curious gaze of others, retreating to a corner by the fireplace. There was a moment of silence before Penfield continued his questioning. "Did you hear any noise during the night after going to bed?" he asked. Jackson shook his head. "I'm a heavy sleeper," he confessed. "Last night I was particularly tired. I fell asleep immediately and didn't wake until Dr. Curtis called me on the house phone, informing me that John Norby was lying dead in the hall. I paused just long enough to grab my flashlight, and then hurried out to join the doctor." Penfield glanced up. "Why did you need your flashlight?" "Because Dr. Curtis told me the lights were out," Jackson replied tersely. Penfield checked his notes for a moment. "When did you last see Mr. Franklin McDermott?" he asked. "When he left Norby's bedroom after witnessing the signing of the codicil." Jackson looked down at his polished shoes, then scanned the room. "I left Miss Stephanie Hull with Mr. Norby a few minutes later and went to my room." "Were you aware that Mr. McDermott planned to leave the house right away?" Penfield inquired. "No, on the contrary, I thought he was still here, as we had all been asked to stay longer," Jackson answered. "I had no idea he left last night until I went to find him early this morning, and Starnes informed me he had already departed." Penfield turned and spoke quietly to the deputy coroner, who nodded attentively, then addressed Jackson. "That's all, Mr. Jackson, thank you." As Jackson stepped down from the witness chair, Dr. Mayo approached Curtis. "Coroner Penfield has called you back to the stand," he said. "Let me." But Curtis didn't wait for the offered assistance. He confidently walked to the witness chair and waited for the coroner to speak. "Dr. Curtis," the coroner flipped back through his notes until he found the relevant entry. "You mentioned in your initial testimony that, to the best of your knowledge, the electric lights were on in the hall when you discovered Mr. Norby's body, since the bulb was warm to the touch. Why then did you tell Mr. Jackson that the lights were out?" Curtis tightened his grip on his cane, his sightless eyes fixed ahead. "From where I stood in the bedroom trying to get through to Mr. Jackson, I heard Mrs. Norby tell her daughter Brandi that the hall was dark," he replied quietly. Penfield shut his notebook and stood up. "You're excused, Doctor. Please take your seat by the fireplace." He waited for Curtis to make his way across the room before turning to Dr. Mayo. "Please call Mrs. Marshall Norby to the stand." Chapter 6. Testimony. As the jury members settled back into their chairs, a sense of relaxation washed over the room, but silence prevailed. Aside from the soft rustling of papers as reporters prepared their notes, the atmosphere was quiet. David Curtis waited patiently, a calm born from his lengthy recovery in hospitals. He was unaware of the curious stares directed at him. The sharp-eyed reporters, sensing an intriguing story in the rumored engagement between the blind surgeon and Brandi Norby, found no revelations in his demeanor. His expression revealed little about his true feelings. On the witness stand, he had confined himself to answering the questions presented to him, neither evading nor embellishing. No one had inquired about why he had entered John Norby's bedroom instead of his own, nor had he mentioned the presence of a woman in the deceased man's room. Could she be the female from Starnes' account, believed by the butler to be Brandi Norby? If that were the case, what did the parrot's cry of "Brandi, I've caught you, you devil," really mean? Had the parrot echoed Norby's last moments? The lines around Curtis's firm mouth tightened as he considered these possibilities. His philosophy in life was straightforward: to live honorably, cherish friendships, and never betray a woman. There are certain souls that find a direct connection, deep calls to deep, and from their very first meeting, Curtis had been captivated by Brandi's charming, vibrant personality. His initial impression had only deepened, and then followed Norby's extraordinary plan for a marriage between them. It was no wonder Curtis had found it hard to shake thoughts of Brandi. The sound of folding doors opening and men rising marked the arrival of Mrs. Norby. Curtis shifted his chair forward to ensure he didn't miss any part of the proceedings. Mrs. Norby was well aware of the focused attention her entrance commanded. With a polite nod to the coroner, she took the chair he indicated and waited calmly for her examination to begin. "Are you a resident of Washington, ma'am?" Coroner Penfield asked after she had taken the oath, and the usual preliminary questions were addressed. "I spend my winters in Washington," Mrs. Norby replied. "I was born in New York." "What was your name before you married?" "Annie Bell Rutherford." Mrs. Norby settled into a more comfortable posture. "I married Marshall Norby 23 years ago and moved to Washington with him. After his passing, I traveled quite a bit, but at my brother-in-law's earnest request, I decided to make Washington my permanent home again." "And did you live with him?" "No, I have an apartment at the Dresden. My daughter Brandi and I usually spend every holiday and weekend here at 10 Acres with my brother-in-law, though." Mrs. Norby preferred to keep her responses brief. She was not one to indulge in excessive chatter. Mr. John Norby was very devoted to Brandi and wanted her near him as much as he could manage. "Mrs. Norby," Penfield set aside his pencil and regarded the attractive widow with intense scrutiny. Her black dress was stylishly cut and flattering, yet he couldn't help but think that her stunning diamond earrings seemed out of place, given the somberness of her attire. "Did your brother-in-law seem himself yesterday, or did he appear troubled?" "John seemed just about as he always does," she said, "except for his excitement over the impending marriage of my daughter to Dr. Curtis. That completely occupied his thoughts." At the mention of Curtis' name, Penfield instinctively glanced to where the surgeon was seated, and Mrs. Norby noticed his gaze. Until that moment, she had not noticed Curtis and hadn't realized he might be in the room. "Mrs. Norby in good spirits during dinner?" he asked after a moment. "Yes, surprisingly so," she replied. "He was his usual self, engaging in conversation, though the headache seemed to put a damper on his mood towards the end of the meal." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, visibly tense in the coroner's presence. "Did he say anything that struck you as unusual?" Penfield pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not particularly," she said thoughtfully. "He did mention some concerns regarding the estate, but that was nothing new. It weighed heavily on his mind these last few months." Penfield made a note before glancing up at her again. "And your daughter, what was her relationship with her uncle?" "Brandi adored him," she interjected, her voice firm. Despite her being a restless sleeper, she always felt a special connection with him. They would often read together or discuss various topics. She wouldn't have caused him harm. "Of course," he replied, though skepticism lingered in his tone. "But what do you make of her being up at that hour, especially with all that had passed?" Mrs. Norby sighed softly, crossing her arms. "I assure you, she was only going for a book. It was nothing more sinister than that." Penfield leaned back, looking thoughtful. "I see. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Norby. We may have more questions later." With that, he took his leave, leaving her to contemplate the weight of his inquiries and the shadow cast over their family. "Norby was on good terms with everyone in his household?" he asked at last. "To the best of my knowledge, yes," she replied, maintaining a steady gaze. "I assure you, sir, I have no insight into why my brother-in-law would take such a desperate and tragic action." "Action, madam?" "By committing suicide." Once more, her fingers played with her lorgnette chain. "This tragedy has unsettled the entire household. Alongside the initial shock, We mourn the loss of a noble gentleman and a dear friend." Curtis wished he could analyze Mrs. Norby's expression more closely. He listened intently to every word of her testimony, focusing on the nuances in her voice, any fleeting pauses, and he felt he had come up short. She displayed remarkable composure and quick thinking. Her account of the incident in the hall with Brandi, which he had overheard, felt rushed, too rushed to convince him of its authenticity. Penfield regarded Mrs. Norby in thoughtful silence for a moment. "I believe that will be all for now, madam," he said politely. "If we need to call on you again during this hearing, please wait in your bedroom." With one last thorough glance at the silent jury and the bustling reporters, Mrs. Norby promptly exited the room. She was followed in quick order by Jules, the chef, and Tiasca, the Filipino, both of whom claimed they had gone to bed early, slept soundly throughout the night, and didn't learn of John Norby's death until Stearns woke them the next morning. Suzanne, Mrs. Norby's maid, recounted that she shared her room with Gretchen, the chambermaid, and they had slept deeply and dreamlessly until being stirred by the anxious butler. When it was Gretchen's turn to testify, she stuttered and stumbled so much that Penfield finally lost patience. "There's no need for tears," he said. "Just answer my question. Did you hear anything unusual last night?" Gretchen nodded wordlessly. 2 large tears filled her blue eyes and blurred her vision, prompting her to wipe them away with the hem of her white apron. She was a strikingly beautiful girl, and the foreman of the jury watched her with admiration. She spoke fairly good English, especially considering how little time she had spent in the country. "What kind of noise was it?" Penfield pressed, noting her silence. "When did you hear it and where?" "People, they talk under my window," she stuttered. "My bed, it is, how do you say?" She gestured gracefully. "It is close by. The woman said, 'I will do it tonight.' And the man replied, 'Don't lose your nerve.' Then, gentlemen, I heard," her eyes widened, "the north door shut, and then I heard footsteps go softly, softly past my door. Then," her voice trailed off. "Well, what?" Penfield asked after a brief silence. "Nothing, gentlemen. I went to sleep." There was a stubbornness in both her tone and expression, and Penfield's displeasure was evident. "Come now," he exclaimed. "You can tell us more than that. If you don't, you could land yourself in serious trouble with the police." "But truly, gentlemen, I went to sleep," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes once again. "I knew nothing more until Stearns banged on our door this morning and said the master was dead." Penfield regarded her steadily. "Did you recognize the woman's voice?" he asked. "Please, gentlemen, it was," she said, glancing around the room in fear. "It was." Her gaze shifted to David Curtis. She noticed him watching her intently, his expression filled with suspense, and her voice faltered. "Get some aromatic spirits of ammonia," Penfield instructed as Dr. Mayo rushed to help her. "She'll be fine in a moment. Let in some fresh air. This room is too stuffy." "What do you think, Doctor?" Curtis asked as he approached. "Is she faking or just fainted?" He gently ran his fingers over the girl's forehead and across her closed eyelids, listening to her rapid breathing. "It's a case of excitement and fright combined," he replied. Just then, Tiasca popped his head through the door at the sound of the commotion and quickly handed Curtis Brandi's bottle of smelling salts, which she had left on the mantel days earlier and forgotten. Curtis waved the salts back and forth in front of Gretchen, and after a few moments, her blue eyes fluttered open, only to close again as he leaned closer. "It's all right, Gretchen." His calm voice had a soothing warmth that eased her frazzled nerves. "You have nothing to fear." "But the gentleman," he said. Her voice was thick with emotion. "I won't tell on my young miss." A pang shot through Curtis's heart. Was Brandi going to be dragged into this investigation again? Coroner Penfield, standing beside him, wasted no time. "Are you referring to Miss Brandi Norby?" he pressed. Gretchen could only nod in response, but that was enough for Penfield. He exchanged a glance with Mayo, and then resumed his examination as his assistant gave the girl a dose of aromatic ammonia. "And the man," he began, "did you also recognize his voice?" "No, sir. Gretchen sat up straighter and handed the empty glass to Mayo. "I'll tell you everything I know," she insisted, extending her hands in a plea. "Everything." "You may go," Penfield said, and with a sideways glance at Curtis, Gretchen slid out of the witness chair and left the room. Curtis returned to his seat by the fireplace, and in her place, Damason stepped forward. He bore a striking resemblance to his brother, but whereas Tiascar was thin and wiry, Damason was taller and solidly built. His testimony was brief and straight to the point, confirming that he had been awakened the previous night by the butler and Franklin McDermott. "Mr. McDermott left in his car," he continued. "After he drove off, I went back to bed." "Did you hear anyone moving around the place, Damason?" Penfield asked. "No, sir." "That's all, thank you." At a nod from the coroner, Damason quickly rose and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "I almost forgot, sir," he said, bowing slightly. "This note has just come for you." Penfield opened the envelope and read the brief message written on the stationery. Turning to the jury, he said, "This is a note from Mr. Franklin McDermott." After adjusting his eyeglasses, he read aloud, "The news of Mr. John Norby's tragic death has shocked me deeply. I have just learned that the inquest is scheduled for 3 o'clock. Unfortunately, I have an engagement I cannot break and will be unable to attend. As you may have been informed, I left 10 acres just before midnight, so I have no knowledge of the distressing events that occurred there after I left, and my testimony would not be useful for your investigation." Penfield set the note aside without further comment. "Mayo," he said, "please ask Miss Stephanie Hull to come here."